Have you ever caught yourself thinking about something so deeply, it almost felt like the thought wasn't yours, but something passing through you? Carl Jung believed that kind of thinking comes from a deeper place, a quiet language the mind speaks when logic stops trying to control everything. It's made of symbols, dreams, and feelings that don't need to be explained to be understood. Tonight, we're slowing down to listen to that inner voice, the one that speaks softly beneath awareness and reminds us that deep thinking isn't about knowing more, but seeing deeper. Chapter 1. The silence between words. We live in an age where silence feels like an absence, an empty space waiting to be filled. But for Carl Jung, silence was not absence. It was presence. He believed that between every word we speak, there exists a quiet field where something deeper listens. And sometimes, that quiet knows more than the voice. When Jung sat with his patients, he didn't rush to interpret or fix. He waited. He watched the pauses, the way a sentence would trail off and disappear, like a wave folding back into the ocean. Because often, he said, the truth is not in what we say, it's in what we cannot quite say yet. Jung once wrote that every human conversation has two layers, the one we hear and the one beneath it, the silent exchange between two unconscious minds. When someone tells a story about their day, they are also telling another story beneath it, about their fears, desires, and memories that words can't fully touch. And if you listen long enough, you start to hear that second story too. Think about how you talk when you're hurt. You might say, "I'm fine," but your tone betrays you. The breath after those words, the way it trembles, hesitates, becomes the real message. Jung listened for that. He knew the psyche speaks through tone, through silence, through the accidental language of emotion. It's as if the unconscious borrows the body to say what the mouth cannot. In everyday life, we fill silence because we fear it. A moment of quiet in conversation feels awkward, even threatening. But for Jung, silence was a kind of microscope. It revealed the small movements of the soul that noise tends to drown out. He believed that the unconscious doesn't shout, it whispers. And if you want to understand yourself, you have to learn to sit still long enough to hear it. Deep thinkers, Jung said, don't seek silence because they dislike people. They seek it because meaning takes time to form. When you pause before answering a question, your mind begins translating something vast into language small enough to speak. That's why true thought is slow. It's like pulling water from a deep well. The bucket must travel a long way before it returns to light. In Jung's writings, silence often surrounds transformation. When someone faces a great change, words seem to vanish first. You don't know what to say because something inside you is shifting, but hasn't yet taken shape. That silence isn't ignorance, it's incubation. The unconscious is working beneath the surface, assembling fragments of insight until one day they rise together as understanding. He compared the psyche to nature. It moves in seasons. There are times for expression and times for retreat. A seed doesn't grow by talking, it grows in darkness. Similarly, the mind renews itself in moments when thinking seems to stop. Jung called this the creative pause, the interval where the conscious and unconscious quietly meet. In that pause, something new is born. Have you ever noticed how certain conversations linger after they end? Hours later, you replay them in your mind, realizing what you really meant to say or what the other person was trying to tell you. That delayed understanding is the unconscious finishing the conversation in its own language. Jung believed this after-echo is where real communication happens. He was fascinated by how silence could heal. Patients often told him their life stories, but it was the silence between their words that revealed what mattered most. Some would pause before mentioning a name, or whisper a detail, or suddenly change the subject. Jung learned to read those hesitations as signposts, the psyche pointing toward something painful but meaningful. Silence, in Jung's psychology, is not emptiness but fullness. It's the space where all possibilities wait. The problem, he thought, is that modern life doesn't allow for that kind of listening. We are surrounded by words, tweets, captions, headlines that keep the surface of the mind constantly rippling. Depth needs still water. To think deeply, then, is to reclaim silence. It's to allow an idea to sit inside you before you decide what it means. Jung advised his students not to analyze everything immediately. Let the dream breathe, he said. Let the image unfold. Interpretation too soon kills mystery, and mystery is what keeps the soul alive. When you listen without rushing to reply, something remarkable happens. The other person starts to hear themselves more clearly. Jung saw this in therapy. Once someone felt truly heard, they often found their own answer. He was not solving problems for them. He was creating silence where truth could grow. The same is true for our inner lives. When we stop filling every moment with explanation, solutions begin to surface naturally. Silence becomes a teacher. You start to notice patterns in your thoughts, voices in your dreams, symbols in your imagination. The unconscious begins to speak in its native language, image, rhythm, emotion, and you start to understand what it's saying. In this sense, silence is not the opposite of language. It's the foundation of it. Every word is born from quiet, shaped by it, defined against it. To Jung, deep thinking was not about building complex sentences, but about returning to that original stillness where ideas first appear. So perhaps the next time you're caught in a pause, during a conversation, or a moment of uncertainty, don't rush to fill it. Listen to the silence instead. It may not be empty. It may be your unconscious trying to translate something ancient and essential into the faint outline of a thought. That is where deep thinking begins, not in speech, but in the silence between words. Chapter 2: When Dreams Begin to Speak. Every night, the mind builds another world. It pulls memories, feelings, and fragments of thought into scenes that seem strange but familiar. Carl Jung believed dreams were not nonsense. They were messages. The unconscious, he said, speaks in symbols because it cannot speak in words. When logic sleeps, the rest of the psyche finally finds its voice. Jung noticed that when people talked about their dreams, they often said, "It didn't make sense." But to him, that was the point. Dreams do not obey the language of the waking mind. They are written in the grammar of emotion, shaped by archetypes and stories as old as humanity itself. A river might mean change. A locked door might mean fear. A stranger might be a forgotten version of yourself. Dreams are not puzzles to be solved, but conversations to be listened to. He used to tell his patients not to rush into interpretation. The dream, he said, is alive. If you dissect it too quickly, it dies. Instead, he asked them to sit with it, to imagine the dream again in silence, to feel it rather than analyze it. What feeling stays with you after waking? What image refuses to leave? The answer to that question is often the message itself. To Jung, dreams were not random. They were the psyche's attempt to restore balance. When your conscious mind becomes too one-sided, too rational, too busy, too certain, the unconscious begins to push back. It speaks through images that correct you, like a friend offering quiet advice. If you dream of falling, perhaps you've climbed too far without grounding yourself. If you dream of drowning, maybe emotion has been ignored for too long. The unconscious always seeks wholeness. He told the story of a man who dreamed of standing before a great mountain. At the top was a temple he longed to reach, but the path was covered in fog. The man woke up anxious, thinking it was just fear of failure. Jung saw something else. The mountain was the self, the totality of being. The fog was the part of life still unknown. The dream wasn't a warning. It was an invitation to climb slowly, to keep faith with the process. Jung believed that when we dream, the psyche tries to show us what we refuse to see in daylight. It doesn't lecture. It paints. It stages small myths just for us. That is why certain dreams feel sacred. They are the unconscious whispering, "Look here, this matters." Deep thinkers, he said, pay attention not because they want to control the dream, but because they want to understand what it's trying to heal. He called this process active imagination. After waking, he would ask people to draw, write, or speak to the images from their dreams. If you dreamed of a child, talk to that child. Ask what it needs. If you dreamed of an ocean, walk toward it in your mind. By engaging with these images, the unconscious begins to unfold its meaning. It's not about translating the dream into logic, but allowing logic to meet mystery halfway. Dreams, Jung said, are democratic. They come to everyone. They don't care about education or intellect. They are the soul's nightly reminder that beneath the noise of daily thought, a vast intelligence watches and guides us. Some call it intuition. Some call it God. Jung simply called it the self, the deep center that knows what we are meant to become. He also believed that recurring dreams signal unresolved conflict. The psyche repeats what has not yet been heard. Each repetition becomes slightly louder until we finally listen. The unconscious, he said, is patient. It will wait years if it must. That is why people can have the same dream since childhood. It's not stuck. We are. In dreams, time and identity blur. You can be yourself and someone else at once. You can die and keep walking. For Jung, this was evidence that the psyche is larger than the ego's boundaries. The dream world is not illusion. It's another dimension of mind, where the laws of logic are replaced by the logic of meaning. He compared the unconscious to a vast ocean and consciousness to a small island floating upon it. At night, the tide rises, washing over the island. When we dream, the boundaries dissolve. The waves bring shells, driftwood, and sometimes storms. In the morning, we awaken among the debris, wondering what it all means. Jung's advice was simple. Don't discard the fragments. They are gifts from the depths. Sometimes, a single dream can change a life. Jung recounted how one of his patients dreamed of a dead tree sprouting new leaves. The man had been in despair for months, certain his life had lost meaning. When Jung asked how the dream felt, the man said, peaceful. That was the message. Growth had already begun, quietly, invisibly. The dream had given him proof that something within still lived. Jung himself dreamed vividly. He once saw himself inside a great house, exploring floor after floor, until he reached a stone cellar. Beneath it, he found ancient bones and artifacts buried in the earth. He realized the dream was about his own mind. The upper floors were his conscious life, the basement his personal unconscious, and below that, the collective unconscious, shared by all humanity. It was the moment he understood that every person carries the entire history of the human soul within. To understand a dream, Jung said, is to speak the language of that inner world. But to speak it, you must first remember that it is not English or German or any spoken tongue. It's emotional, symbolic, circular. It tells the truth sideways, through metaphor and motion. That's why people who think deeply often seem poetic when they describe their inner lives. They are translating dreams into speech. In the end, Jung believed that dreams keep us honest. They reveal where we pretend, where we avoid, and where we've forgotten to feel. Every dream is a mirror, and every symbol a reflection of something real inside us. To ignore them is to ignore ourselves. When dreams begin to speak, the wise thing is not to analyze, but to listen. Behind the strange images, behind the surreal logic, lies a voice trying to restore our balance. A voice that knows, even when we do not, who we really are. Chapter 4. The Symbolic Mind. Carl Jung believed that to think deeply is to think symbolically. The conscious mind uses logic, but the unconscious uses images. Where reason builds arguments, the psyche builds stories. Every emotion, every dream, every myth is written in this ancient symbolic language, one that existed long before words. He noticed that when people described their feelings, they rarely used plain speech. They said, "I feel heavy," or "I'm in the dark," or "I'm floating." These aren't metaphors chosen by chance. They are the unconscious speaking through the body. When you say you feel stuck, something in your psyche truly feels trapped. When you say you feel light, some burden has lifted. Jung realized that if you learn to read these images, you start to understand the hidden logic of your own mind. Symbols, to Jung, are not decorations of thought. They are thought at its deepest level. They bridge what logic cannot reach. He wrote that a symbol is the best possible expression of something we do not yet fully understand. It points toward meaning, not explanation. For example, a circle drawn in a child's dream might not mean anything literal, but to Jung, it represents wholeness, the psyche's instinct toward balance and completion. He saw this everywhere, in art, religion, and myth. The cross, the serpent, the sun, the labyrinth. These images appear in cultures that never met, yet they tell the same inner story. That, Jung said, is proof of the collective unconscious, the shared memory of humanity speaking through symbols. We are born with these ancient images imprinted in the psyche, and they rise whenever words fail to express what we feel. Jung often compared symbols to bridges between two worlds, the conscious and the unconscious. Logic can take us only halfway. To cross, we need imagination. Deep thinkers are not those who reject reason, but those who allow reason and imagination to cooperate. They know that insight often arrives not as a sentence, but as an image, a flash, a pattern, a feeling that demands interpretation. He used this understanding in therapy. When a patient described a dream or drawing, Jung didn't analyze it like a code to crack. He asked what emotion the image evoked. A mountain might represent a goal for one person, but for another, it might symbolize isolation. Meaning, he said, is never fixed. It grows through dialogue. The symbol is alive. The moment you think you've defined it completely, it loses its power. That's why Jung admired myths so deeply. Myths are symbolic stories that contain truths logic alone cannot hold. The tale of Icarus is not about a boy with wings. It's about human ambition and the danger of hubris. The story of the phoenix is not about a bird. It's about renewal, the psyche's instinct to rise from despair. We still respond to these tales because they describe the shape of our inner life. Each of us is, in some way, living a myth. He saw that even modern people who think they've outgrown myth still live symbolically. We speak of climbing the ladder, chasing dreams, burning out. Our language remains mythic because our psyche never stopped speaking that way. The symbolic mind is not a stage we left behind. It's the foundation beneath everything we call rational. For Jung, the loss of symbolism in modern life was dangerous. When we stop recognizing symbols, we lose our ability to connect to meaning. We begin to mistake literal truth for the only kind of truth. But the psyche needs metaphor the way the body needs air. Without it, the inner world becomes flat, mechanical, lifeless. The symbolic mind keeps us alive to mystery, to the awareness that reality is larger than what can be measured. He once wrote that symbols are transformers of energy. A symbol doesn't just represent something, it changes it. When grief becomes the image of winter, it stops being chaos and becomes a season. When fear becomes a storm, it becomes something that will pass. To name something symbolically is to begin healing it. That's why rituals, art, and poetry matter. They give emotion a form, turning confusion into connection. The difference between a literal mind and a symbolic one, Jung said, is that the literal mind asks, "Is this true?" while the symbolic mind asks, "What does this mean?" Truth without meaning is sterile. Meaning without truth is fantasy. Deep thinking lives where the two meet. It's the ability to see the outer world and the inner world reflecting each other, like two mirrors facing endlessly. In therapy, Jung often drew mandalas, circular diagrams representing order in chaos. He noticed his patients began drawing them too, spontaneously, during times of change. It was as if the psyche, overwhelmed by uncertainty, created symbols to restore balance. The mandala became one of Jung's most powerful symbols of wholeness. He said it was not a human invention, but an archetype that emerged when consciousness needed healing. To develop a symbolic mind is to live poetically, not sentimentally. It means seeing everyday things as carriers of deeper truth. A broken cup becomes a lesson in impermanence. A window opening becomes the start of possibility. This way of seeing doesn't detach us from life. It roots us more deeply in it. The world becomes alive again, filled with signs and metaphors, whispering meanings if we pause to notice. Jung believed that thinking symbolically keeps us humble. It reminds us that no single idea can capture the full complexity of experience. A symbol always points beyond itself, to the mystery that cannot be spoken, only lived. The task of the deep thinker, then, is not to solve the world, but to translate between worlds, from image to word, from unconscious to conscious, from inner to outer. And maybe that's why symbols still touch us, even when we don't believe in them. They are the language of our origins. When we dream, imagine, or create, we are speaking that ancient tongue again. We are remembering how the soul once thought, not in logic, but in light. Chapter 5. The Trickster's Tongue. Every culture has a story about a being who breaks the rules, a god who lies, steals, and laughs at sacred order, yet somehow brings wisdom through chaos. The Greeks called him Hermes. The Norse knew him as Loki. For Carl Jung, this archetype lived not only in myth, but in every human psyche. He called it the trickster, the voice inside that disrupts patterns, exposes illusions, and forces us to grow by making fools of us first. The trickster's language is irony. It speaks in reversals, mistakes, and coincidences that sting at first, but reveal truth later. Jung noticed that when people became too serious, too certain, or too moral, life itself would play tricks on them. A lost opportunity, a wrong turn, a coincidence that mocked their plans. These moments, he believed, were not punishments, but reminders that the unconscious has its own humor. When consciousness becomes rigid, the psyche sends the trickster to loosen it. The trickster appears whenever the ego tries to control everything. You think you're perfectly calm, and suddenly you snap at someone. You promise to change, then repeat the same habit. You prepare a speech, and the words vanish. Each failure becomes a joke the unconscious plays to remind you you're human. Jung said that if you don't laugh at your shadow, the trickster will do it for you. In his studies of myths, Jung noticed that the trickster is often both divine and ridiculous. Part god, part clown. He steals fire for humanity, brings language or reshapes the world, but always through chaos. This contradiction, he said, mirrors our own psyche. We are capable of wisdom only because we can make mistakes. The trickster shows that creation and destruction are twins, that progress is born from error. Jung's insight was that this archetype isn't just cultural, it's psychological. It lives in each of us as the part that resists order, mocks authority, and breaks patterns. It's the part that says the wrong thing, that questions every rule, that sabotages your careful plans, not to ruin you, but to wake you up. When life feels out of control, it might be the trickster reminding you that too much control is its own kind of blindness. He saw the trickster as the raw energy of transformation. When the conscious mind gets trapped in old habits, this figure enters to disrupt. It uses humor, paradox, and absurdity to break illusions. A dream of falling, a sudden embarrassment, a friend's joke that hits too close, all are the psyche's way of saying, "You've taken yourself too seriously." Jung said that wisdom begins when you can laugh at yourself without contempt. He often pointed to the role of the jester in ancient courts. The fool could speak truth to kings because laughter disarmed power. In the same way, the trickster within us keeps the ego from becoming a tyrant. When you catch yourself pretending to be flawless, life finds a way to trip you, not to humiliate, but to humble. Without that balance, consciousness would harden into pride, and growth would stop. In therapy, Jung sometimes used humor as medicine. A patient obsessed with perfection might confess a small absurdity, and he would smile, saying, "Good, now you are becoming real." For him, laughter wasn't denial. It was release. It showed that the psyche was flexible again. The trickster's tongue may sting, but it softens the rigid. It teaches through play what logic cannot teach through discipline. He also saw this archetype in collective life. Whole societies, he warned, fall under the trickster's spell when they become too moralistic or self-assured. History repeats jokes on civilizations that forget humility. Every exaggeration of the good, he wrote, turns into the opposite. The trickster ensures that what's repressed will return, not as evil, but as irony. The gods we worship too seriously always end up laughing back at us. Deep thinkers recognize this pattern in themselves. They know that error is part of knowledge. They don't fear contradiction, they study it. Jung believed that intelligence without self-irony becomes arrogance, and spirituality without humor becomes fanaticism. The trickster guards against both. It keeps the soul alive by refusing to let it ossify into certainty. He once described a patient who dreamed of a clown standing at the door of a cathedral, blocking entry. The dreamer was a man who lived by strict moral rules and despised laughter. Jung told him, "That clown is your salvation." The man didn't understand at first, but slowly he realized the dream was asking him to bring joy and imperfection back into his faith, to let the divine breathe again. The trickster was not mocking God, it was mocking his rigidity. To understand the trickster's tongue, you must learn to read paradox. When something feels like failure, ask what part of you needed to fail. When life feels absurd, ask what belief has been exposed. Jung said the psyche loves balance, and the trickster restores it through mischief. If the light becomes too blinding, it flicks the switch to darkness. If the ego becomes too proud, it whispers a joke that cuts it down. In your own life, the trickster might appear as the day everything goes wrong. You're late, you spill coffee, you forget something crucial. In those moments, instead of cursing fate, you might try asking what rhythm you've been ignoring. Have you been rushing, controlling, pretending? Sometimes the universe doesn't punish you, it just pranks you. The trickster reminds us that enlightenment isn't solemn. It's flexible, earthy, a little wild. Jung said that laughter is a sign that consciousness is expanding, that we've stopped identifying completely with our own drama. When you can see the comedy in your story, you're no longer trapped inside it. In the end, the trickster's gift is freedom. It frees you from rigidity, from false virtue, from the illusion that life must always make sense. It frees you to be whole, which means to be contradictory, imperfect, alive. Jung saw humor not as the opposite of depth, but as its companion. The psyche that can laugh is a psyche that can heal. So when life mocks your plans or exposes your pride, don't rush to fix it. Listen. The trickster may be speaking. Its words sound like chaos, but underneath them is an old intelligence, smiling, reminding you that sometimes the shortest path to truth begins with a very human mistake. Chapter 6. The Mirror of Emotion. Carl Jung once said that feeling is not the enemy of thought. It is its companion. To him, emotion was not a disturbance in reason, but a language reason had forgotten how to read. Deep thinking, he believed, begins not in ideas, but in feeling, because feeling tells you where the mind should look. In the quiet of therapy, Jung watched how emotion revealed truth long before words did. A patient might speak calmly about a painful memory, but then pause, blink, and their voice would tremble. That tremor, he said, was the real story. The body, like the unconscious, never lies. Every emotion is a signal, a reflection of the psyche's balance or imbalance. To ignore it is to cover the mirror and wonder why you can't see clearly. He believed emotions are mirrors, not in the sense that they merely reflect, but that they show you yourself. Anger, fear, jealousy, grief, these are not flaws to eliminate, but messages to decode. When you feel anger, it's rarely about the present moment. It's the unconscious shouting, "A boundary has been crossed." When you feel envy, it's pointing toward a hidden desire. When you feel sadness, it's showing where you've attached meaning and now must let go. Each feeling is a conversation between consciousness and the deeper self. The mistake of modern life, Jung thought, was that it glorifies intellect while treating emotion as weakness. We analyze feelings as if they were problems to fix, rather than messengers to listen to. But emotion carries instinctive intelligence, the wisdom of the body, older than logic itself. Without it, thinking becomes sterile. You can reason endlessly about your life and still feel empty, because the heart has not been consulted. Jung noticed that deep thinkers often repress emotion, believing it clouds judgment. But when emotion is suppressed, it does not vanish, it sinks. The unconscious absorbs what consciousness rejects, and over time, it begins to speak through symptoms, dreams, and moods. A person who denies sadness may find themselves chronically tired. Someone who hides anger might develop anxiety. The psyche insists on being felt, one way or another. He compared this process to a river. When you dam emotion, the water doesn't disappear. It swells behind the wall, gathering force until it spills over in unexpected ways. But when you allow it to flow, even slowly, it nourishes the landscape of the mind. Emotion is meant to move. Its purpose is circulation, not control. In Jung's view, every emotion contains its opposite. Love carries fear of loss. Joy carries awareness of fragility. Even rage can hide grief. To understand a feeling, he said, you must hold it gently enough to see what lives underneath. The conscious mind wants simple labels, happy, sad, angry, but the psyche doesn't speak in absolutes. It speaks in blends, in tones and gradations. Deep thinkers learn to stand in that ambiguity without rushing to classify. He used to ask patients, "Where in your body do you feel it?" A question that seems simple but opens a door. Because emotion is embodied thought. It's not just chemical, it's symbolic. A tight chest might represent guilt or self-protection. A heavy stomach might be unprocessed grief. By noticing these sensations, you allow the unconscious to speak through the body, and awareness begins to form where repression once lived. One of Jung's most profound ideas was that emotion connects the personal with the collective. When you feel despair, you are not alone. You are touching something that has always existed in humanity. That's why certain emotions feel infinite. You cry not only for yourself, but for every person who has ever felt loss. Emotion is the thread that weaves individual experience into the larger fabric of life. He also observed that the shadow often hides behind strong emotions. What we judge in others usually mirrors what we refuse to feel in ourselves. If someone's confidence irritates you, perhaps you've neglected your own. If someone's sadness makes you uncomfortable, maybe you've buried your own grief. The world becomes a projection screen for our unacknowledged feelings. Recognizing this doesn't make emotion weaker. It makes it cleaner, more conscious, more honest. For Jung, Emotional honesty was a form of courage. It means facing your own inner weather without flinching. When anger rises, you don't have to act on it, but you must notice it. When sorrow comes, you don't have to explain it, but you must feel it. Emotion is like light. It shows what's there. Closing your eyes doesn't make it disappear. It just leaves you in the dark. He once described emotion as the bridge to the unconscious. It connects what we know with what we don't yet know. Intuition often travels that bridge, the subtle sense that something matters before you can articulate why. To trust that feeling is to trust the psyche itself. Jung's patients who learned to follow emotion rather than flee from it often discovered meaning where they thought there was only chaos. Art and music fascinated him for this reason. They bypass logic and speak directly to feeling. A painting doesn't explain its emotion. It is its emotion. That's why a single color or chord can move you to tears without a single word. In that moment, you are fluent again in the psyche's first language. Jung believed that reconnecting with this emotional literacy was essential for modern people cut off from the symbolic and the sacred. He knew that emotion can overwhelm, too, that people can drown in feeling without grounding. But he insisted that the solution is not avoidance, but integration. Emotion becomes destructive only when isolated. When the mind and feeling work together, emotion becomes guidance, not chaos. It tells you what matters, where to look, what still needs to be reconciled. To think deeply, Jung said, is to think with the whole being, mind, body, and feeling as one. The intellect gives structure. Emotion gives life. The two must dance, not compete. He believed the world suffers not from too much emotion, but from too little understanding of it. In the end, Jung's lesson was simple. Emotion is not the opposite of wisdom. It is its beginning. The calmest minds are not those without feeling, but those that have learned to listen to it. When you stop fighting emotion, it stops fighting you. It becomes a mirror, clear and bright, showing not who you wish to be, but who you truly are. Chapter 7. When the Self Speaks. There are moments in life when something beyond reason seems to reach out and touch us. A coincidence so precise it feels designed. A dream that bleeds into waking reality. A word overheard at the exact moment you needed it. Carl Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, where inner experience and outer event mirror each other without any logical cause. He saw it not as magic, but as the voice of the self, the totality of who we are, conscious and unconscious, trying to communicate through the patterns of the world. To Jung, the self was not the ego's creation. The ego is the I that acts, decides, plans. The self is the deeper center, the unseen architect of meaning. It doesn't speak in words or logic. It speaks in symbols, timing, and resonance. The quiet alignment between thought and event that makes us stop and say, that can't just be coincidence. Jung believed these moments were invitations, not accidents. They were the psyche's way of showing that life and mind are not separate things, but reflections of one another. He came to this understanding through experience, not theory. During his own period of turmoil, Jung began noticing that his dreams and daily life seemed to echo each other. He would dream of an image, a serpent, a circle, an ancient god, and the same image would later appear in the world around him, in a book, a symbol, or a conversation. It was as if the boundary between the inner and outer worlds had dissolved, and both were part of the same dialogue. He wrote that the psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing. The self, he said, speaks in this shared language. When your conscious mind is fixated on a question, and the world seems to answer it through events, it's not the world changing for you. It's your awareness expanding enough to see the pattern already there. Synchronicity is the moment when meaning itself becomes visible. You recognize something that feels ancient and intimate, that your life in all its chaos has a hidden design. Jung told the story of a woman he treated who was trapped in rationalism. She dismissed every emotional or symbolic interpretation he offered. One day, she described a dream of a golden scarab, an ancient Egyptian symbol of transformation. As she spoke, Jung heard a tapping at the window. He turned to see a scarab-like beetle trying to enter. He caught it, handed it to her, and said, "Here is your scarab." The shock of that coincidence broke her resistance. For the first time, she saw that the world could mirror the soul. It was a small, impossible moment, but it opened the door to change. Jung didn't claim that synchronicity could be proven like physics. He called it an acausal connecting principle, a pattern of meaning that exists beyond cause and effect. In a way, it was his answer to modern alienation. The modern mind sees life as random, but Jung saw it as alive with purpose. He believed that meaning is not invented, it's discovered. And the self reveals it when we are ready to listen. These experiences often appear when life becomes uncertain, in times of grief, crisis, or transition. When the ego weakens, the self steps forward. It uses coincidence the way dreams use symbols, as a way to lead consciousness toward what it refuses to see. A person who feels powerless may begin encountering symbols of strength. Someone avoiding change might find change everywhere they look. The self arranges reminders until awareness awakens. He described the self as an inner compass, always trying to restore balance. When we stray too far from authenticity, it calls us back through intuition, emotion, and synchronicity. But Jung warned that we must approach these experiences with humility. To claim every coincidence as destiny is to inflate the ego, to mistake the message for the messenger. The point is not that the universe revolves around us, but that we are connected to it in ways deeper than we understand. Jung saw this connection reflected in nature. He believed that the human psyche is part of the same pattern that shapes the movement of stars, rivers, and seasons. The self, in this sense, is both personal and cosmic. When it speaks, it does so through the grammar of life itself: timing, repetition, rhythm. The flower blooming just as a friendship ends. The storm beginning just as an emotion breaks. These are not coincidences to Jung. They are synchronies, the self speaking in the language of the world. For him, listening to that language required a special kind of attention, what he called symbolic consciousness. It's a way of seeing that doesn't divide inner from outer. It understands that what happens in us and what happens to us are often two sides of one process. The unconscious is not a hidden basement of the mind. It's the other half of reality. To live symbolically, then, is to treat events as messages, not just occurrences. He often told his students that the self speaks most clearly when the ego stops trying to control. When we loosen our grip on plans and expectations, the pattern reveals itself. Life begins to flow with a sense of rightness that is hard to describe. Not easy, not painless, but aligned. Jung called this experience the path toward individuation, becoming the person your soul is trying to make you. Synchronicity is the self's way of saying, yes, this way. But Jung also knew that the self can speak through conflict, not just harmony. Sometimes, the world mirrors back the parts of us we've ignored. A person who hides their anger may attract situations that force it out. Someone avoiding truth may find themselves surrounded by people who lie. These are not punishments. They are mirrors. The self speaks in whatever language we are most likely to understand, even if that language is pain. To recognize this is to move from victimhood to participation. You begin to see your life not as a sequence of random events, but as a dialogue with something vast, something that listens, answers, and guides, even through disorder. Jung once said that the self is like a hidden God within us, creating coincidences to lead us toward wholeness. But it does not shout. It whispers through the rhythm of things. When the self speaks, it doesn't demand belief, only awareness. It asks you to notice, to stay curious, to follow the thread of meaning wherever it leads. Some call it fate, some call it intuition, others call it grace. Jung called it the language of the self, the moment when the psyche and the world breathe in sync, and reality itself begins to sound like a conversation. Perhaps that's the heart of deep thinking, not to control the world, but to listen to it. To understand that thought doesn't end inside the mind, but extends outward, shaping and being shaped by the world around it. When the self speaks, the border between inner and outer disappears. And in that silence between coincidence and meaning, you realize it was never speaking to you. It was speaking through you. Chapter 8: The Art of Listening to Yourself. Carl Jung believed that most people don't truly listen, not to others, and certainly not to themselves. The world is loud, full of advice, noise, and judgment. But beneath that outer volume, the psyche whispers. It tries to guide us through symbols, feelings, dreams, and small impulses that often go unnoticed. Jung called the act of hearing this inner voice active imagination, a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between the thinker and what thinks through them. To Jung, the unconscious was not a pit of chaos, but a field of meaning. It held forgotten parts of ourselves, waiting to be acknowledged. He noticed that when people ignored that inner conversation, their lives grew shallow and repetitive. The same conflicts returned, the same emotions circled back. The psyche, he said, will repeat its message until it is heard. Listening to yourself is not a luxury, it is a necessity for growth. He encouraged his patients to speak with their inner figures as if they were real people. The voice of fear, the inner critic, the lost child, the wise guide, all are expressions of the same mind. The goal wasn't to silence them, but to understand them. Every voice in the psyche, Jung wrote, deserves a hearing. When you refuse to listen, those voices grow louder through symptoms, dreams, or projections onto others. When you listen, they soften and integrate. But Jung knew this kind of listening is not easy. The ego wants control. It wants to decide which thoughts are acceptable and which are not. The unconscious, however, doesn't ask for permission. It shows you what you've been avoiding, through dreams that unsettle, fantasies that confuse, or emotions that embarrass. The first step, Jung said, is humility, the willingness to admit that you don't fully know yourself. Only then does true dialogue begin. He often described active imagination as a creative act, When you close your eyes and return to a powerful dream or image, something starts to happen. The image moves, it responds, it speaks. Jung believed that imagination is not make-believe, it's a meeting ground. Consciousness brings awareness, the unconscious brings depth. Together, they create something new, understanding. He compared this process to watching a play unfold inside the mind. You are both audience and actor, witness and participant. The key is not to control the story, but to stay present as it reveals itself. You might imagine a conversation with your anxiety, asking what it wants. You might visualize walking through a landscape that represents your mood. The point is not to escape reality, but to deepen your awareness of it. Every image is a message in disguise. For Jung, this inner listening was a form of healing. The psyche, he said, has a natural drive toward wholeness. When something is repressed, it doesn't vanish. It waits to be heard. Active imagination gives it a voice. He once wrote that patients who learned to dialogue with their unconscious often began to dream differently. The dreams became less chaotic, more purposeful. The mind responded to being heard the way a friend does, with trust. Modern life, Jung warned, has forgotten how to listen. We look outward for answers, experts, influencers, statistics, trends. But the psyche doesn't live on the surface. It speaks in moods, accidents, and intuitions. Subtle signals easy to dismiss. The art of listening to yourself begins with slowing down. It begins when you stop asking the world who you should be and start asking quietly, what is trying to become known in me? He noticed that silence was often the turning point in analysis. When a patient stopped talking and began to feel, really feel, something profound would emerge. It might be grief, or longing, or relief, but underneath it was always the same realization. I have been avoiding myself. Jung said that true change begins not with insight, but with contact. To meet your inner life without denial is to re-enter reality more fully. He saw this not as self-absorption, but as self-relationship. The person who listens inwardly becomes more compassionate outwardly because they no longer project their disowned parts onto others. When you know your own anger, you stop hating it in others. When you befriend your own fear, you stop judging those who are afraid. Listening to yourself teaches empathy because you begin to recognize how much of human life is shared beneath the surface. Jung often painted his inner visions, turning them into tangible images. His Red Book is filled with these records, a journal of his dialogue with the unconscious. He didn't create them to explain his psyche, but to witness it. Through image and color, he gave form to forces that could not be captured by analysis alone. He called this giving the soul a body. To him, creation was another form of listening, the hand recording what the psyche whispers. He also believed that the inner voice changes tone as we grow. Early in life, it may appear as resistance or rebellion, the part of you that refuses conformity. Later, it becomes intuition, the quiet guidance that helps you make choices aligned with your deeper values. If you ignore it, life begins to feel meaningless. If you follow it, it leads not to comfort, but to authenticity. Jung said that listening to the unconscious is rarely pleasant, but it is always necessary. He used to remind his students that the unconscious is not moral in the usual sense. It contains everything, light and dark, creation and destruction. Listening means facing contradictions without collapsing into them. It requires strength to hear the full truth of what you are. Jung often compared this to standing in a storm. The goal is not to stop the wind, but to stay upright long enough to understand its direction. This practice is not confined to meditation or therapy. It can happen while walking, drawing, or sitting alone at night. When the noise of the day fades, the psyche begins to speak. Sometimes it speaks through sudden emotion, sometimes through a strange calm. The key is attention, not analysis, not judgment, but presence. As Jung wrote, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." Listening is the first form of acceptance. Over time, Jung noticed that people who learned to listen inwardly began to find meaning even in suffering. Pain stopped feeling like punishment and started to feel like instruction. The unconscious was not cruel, only persistent. It repeats what you ignore until you understand. And once you do, it moves on, leading you to the next lesson. To listen to yourself, then, is not to retreat from the world. It is to return to it more whole. When the inner dialogue is alive, outer life becomes richer. You begin to recognize the same symbols and messages that once only appeared in dreams, now unfolding in everyday moments. You sense that life, too, is listening back. Jung believed that this was the foundation of all individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you are meant to be. The self, that deep organizing intelligence, doesn't shout. It speaks softly, through feelings, through coincidences, through intuition. Your task is to keep the channel open. To practice the art of listening to yourself is to remember that your mind is not just a thinker, it's a landscape. Somewhere inside, the unconscious is always speaking. Sometimes it speaks in images, sometimes in silence, but it is always trying to bring you closer to wholeness. The question is simple: will you pause long enough to hear it? Chapter 9. Archetypes. The universal language. Carl Jung believed that beneath every individual story lies a shared pattern. The same dreams, fears, and hopes echo across generations, cultures, and time. He called these recurring patterns archetypes, universal images that shape the way we think, feel, and imagine. They are not learned but inherited, as old as the human mind itself. They live in what Jung named the collective unconscious, a deep layer of the psyche that connects all people, whether they know it or not. When Jung studied myths, fairy tales, and religions, he found the same figures appearing again and again. The hero who faces danger, the mother who nurtures, the trickster who disrupts, the wise old man who guides, and the shadow that tests. Different cultures gave them different names, but their essence remained unchanged. To Jung, this was not coincidence. It was proof that human beings share an inner language made of symbols. Archetypes are the grammar of that language. They express the structure of human experience before it becomes personal. The mother archetype, for instance, doesn't refer to any particular mother. It represents nourishment, safety, and creation, the feeling of being protected by life itself. The shadow is not simply your flaws, it is the collective image of what humanity fears in itself. These archetypes live within us, shaping perception and behavior from the background. Jung said that we do not invent archetypes. We discover them in ourselves, as if uncovering ancient ruins buried in the soul. They appear in dreams, myths, films, and even in everyday moments. The person you admire might carry the image of the hero for you. The boss you resent might embody the tyrant. The friend you turn to for advice might represent the sage. Without realizing it, we live in stories that began long before we were born. He often compared archetypes to rivers, ancient currents flowing beneath the surface of consciousness. Our individual lives are like boats carried by those currents. We may think we are steering, but the patterns of the psyche guide our direction. The hero's journey, for example, is a timeless map of transformation, departure, struggle, death, and rebirth. Every person who faces change walks that path in some form. Jung saw this most clearly in his patient's dreams. A modern engineer might dream of slaying a dragon, just as an ancient knight once did. A young woman might dream of a descent into water, echoing myths of Persephone or Inanna. The symbols were not random. They were expressions of the same archetypal drama playing out in different lives. The unconscious uses these images because they carry emotional truth that words cannot convey. But Jung warned that archetypes are double-edged. They can guide us toward growth or consume us in illusion. When a person identifies too strongly with an archetype, they become possessed by it. The hero turns arrogant, convinced of their destiny. The lover becomes obsessive, confusing passion with purpose. The wise one becomes detached, mistaking distance for insight. Jung called this inflation, when an archetypal force expands the ego beyond proportion. To live wisely is not to reject archetypes, but to recognize them without surrendering your individuality. He believed that modern people, though surrounded by technology and reason, remain driven by myth. The difference is that we no longer recognize it. The myth of progress, the myth of success, the myth of the self-made individual, these are our modern gods. Jung said that when a society stops telling its myths consciously, those myths return unconsciously as obsessions, ideologies, or collective crises. What we fail to recognize in story, we act out in reality. For Jung, understanding archetypes was a way of reclaiming awareness. When you see your life as part of a larger pattern, suffering gains meaning. The heartbreak becomes part of the lover's journey. The failure becomes part of the hero's descent. The loss becomes the call toward renewal. Archetypes do not remove pain, but they give it purpose. They remind us that what feels personal is often profoundly human. He described archetypes as psychic organs, invisible structures that give shape to experience, the way bones give shape to the body. Just as the eye evolved to see light, the psyche evolved to see meaning. Archetypes are the forms through which we recognize that meaning. They're why certain stories move us so deeply, because they touch something already written within. Jung believed that creativity arises when an archetype begins to stir. Artists, he said, are translators of the collective unconscious. A painter who depicts light and darkness is exploring the eternal dance of opposites. A writer who describes transformation is expressing the archetype of rebirth. This is why art feels timeless. It speaks to what all people already know in their depths. He also saw that archetypes change shape with culture. The hero of one era might become the explorer or the scientist of another. The Great Mother might appear as nature, or even as the digital network that connects humanity. The forms evolve, but the patterns remain. Archetypes adapt to our time, just as we unconsciously adapt to them. Jung urged people to approach archetypes with respect, not worship. They are psychological realities, not divine beings. To engage them consciously is to enter dialogue with the forces that move through us. When you recognize the hero in yourself, you also recognize the shadow that opposes it. When you feel drawn to guide others, you must watch for the wise one's pride. Each archetype carries light and dark, potential and peril intertwined. He believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, depends on learning this balance. Wholeness comes not from rejecting archetypes, but from integrating them. The hero must learn compassion. The lover must learn boundaries. The thinker must learn to feel. The point is not to escape the patterns, but to move within them consciously, like a dancer aware of the rhythm that moves their body. Jung often ended his lectures by reminding students that the unconscious is not foreign or frightening. It is the story of humanity living inside each of us. To explore it is to return home, to rediscover the ancient mind that dreamed the world into being. Every image, every symbol, every emotion connects us to something larger than ourselves. To think deeply, in Jung's sense, is to see your personal life as a chapter in this vast collective narrative. You are not isolated. You are the latest expression of archetypes that have walked through millions of lives before yours. The mother, the child, the healer, the wanderer. They all live within you, waiting to be known, expressed, and balanced. In the end, Jung said that archetypes remind us of our shared humanity. When we recognize them, we stop feeling alone in our struggles. We see that our dreams are not random. They are ancient messages written in a universal language. The task of a deep thinker is to learn to read that language, to hear in their own life the echoes of every life that came before. Because the archetypes never die. They simply change masks and keep speaking through us forever. Chapter 10. The Two Voices. Within, Carl Jung believed that every human being carries two centers of awareness, the ego and the self. They are not enemies, but they speak in different voices. The ego is the part of us that says, I want, I think, I decide. It manages daily life, making plans, solving problems, maintaining identity. The self is older, deeper, and infinitely wider. It is the total field of consciousness and unconsciousness combined, the mysterious intelligence that organizes dreams, symbols, and intuition. The ego looks outward, the self looks inward and beyond. Most people, Jung said, live almost entirely within the voice of the ego. It's the voice of goals, fears, opinions, and pride. The voice that tries to define life in linear sentences. The self speaks differently. It speaks through images, feelings, and moments of stillness. It doesn't argue. It waits. When you sense something meaningful without knowing why, that's the self whispering beneath the noise. To think deeply, in Jung's sense, is to learn how to hear both voices and to keep them in dialogue. He often described the relationship between the ego and the self as like a small circle within a larger one. The small circle believes it's the whole sky until experience begins to stretch it. Then something unexpected happens. A dream that feels like revelation, a loss that shakes identity, a coincidence that defies reason. The ego realizes it is not the whole story. Beyond its borders lies something vast and creative, something that knows more than we consciously do. Jung warned that the ego resists this discovery. It fears losing control. It wants certainty, order, and mastery. The self, however, moves by paradox. It teaches through opposites, joy and grief, light and shadow, gain and loss. The ego calls this chaos. The self calls it balance. Maturity, Jung believed, begins when the ego stops pretending to be the master and accepts its role as the servant of a greater process. He learned this not from theory, but from his own breakdown. After his split with Freud, Jung entered a period of deep uncertainty. He began to dream in images he could not explain. Floods, gods, ancient symbols rising from the depths. He realized these visions were not madness, but communication. His conscious mind had collapsed, and the self had begun to speak. He spent years recording these dialogues in his Red Book, learning that the unconscious was not an abyss, but an inner teacher. The ego, he saw, could survive only if it learned to listen. The ego's job, he said, is navigation. It keeps us functional in the world, but it cannot give life meaning on its own. Without the self, it becomes hollow, addicted to control and recognition. The self, on the other hand, needs the ego to make its insights real. Without the ego, the self remains dreamlike and abstract. The goal of individuation, Jung's term for psychological wholeness, is not to destroy the ego, but to align it with the self, so that the two work together rather than against each other. He often illustrated this balance through myth. In many ancient stories, a mortal hero must serve a divine or hidden power. That relationship mirrors the psyche. The ego, the hero, believes it acts freely, but every trial and encounter leads it closer to something beyond itself. The hero's ultimate task is surrender, not as defeat, but as integration. When the hero returns home, they are no longer the same. They have learned to carry the voice of the self within them. Jung said this dialogue plays out in every person's life. When you ignore the unconscious, it pushes back through frustration, illness, or fate. When you listen, the same events become meaningful. The unconscious does not force, it balances. If your conscious life becomes too rigid, the self brings chaos. If you drift into confusion, the self introduces structure. It is always guiding toward the middle path, a dynamic harmony that the ego can rarely see until much later. He saw this duality reflected even in language. People say, "Something told me not to do that," or "I knew it deep down." Jung believed these phrases were not poetic accidents. They point to an inner voice older than the ego. The mind contains a witness, a part that observes and understands beyond thought. This witness is the self. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It speaks in the language of intuition, in the calm certainty that rises when the noise stops. But the relationship between ego and self is rarely peaceful. The ego resists surrender because it confuses surrender with annihilation. To admit there's a greater intelligence inside feels like death to its authority. Jung said this inner tension is unavoidable and necessary. Transformation happens only when the ego's limits are exposed. The self grows through conflict, the way muscles grow through resistance. Every time life contradicts your plans, the deeper voice is trying to widen your perspective. He used the metaphor of alchemy to describe this process. In alchemy, base metals are transformed into gold through fire and dissolution. For Jung, this was a perfect symbol of psychological growth. The base metal is the ego, dense, limited, self-centered. The gold is the self, unified, luminous, incorruptible. The alchemical fire is life itself, loss, confusion, failure, love, insight. The two voices melt and merge through experience, creating something new, a consciousness that includes both reason and mystery. He warned that identifying solely with the self can be as dangerous as ignoring it. People who believe they've transcended their ego often become inflated. They mistake intuition for infallibility. Jung called this spiritual inflation, the shadow side of awakening. The goal is not to replace the ego with the self, but to keep them in constant conversation. The ego must bow, not vanish. The self must lead, but never dominate. The tension between the two is what keeps life alive. He taught that listening to both voices requires practice. The ego's voice is fast, sharp, and familiar. The self's voice is slow, quiet, and indirect. It speaks in dreams, synchronicities, and moods that seem to come from nowhere. When something in you says, "Wait," or "This matters," even if you can't explain it, that's usually the self. Jung advised people to notice such moments without forcing interpretation. Meaning, he said, unfolds only when approached with patience. He saw this relationship reflected in art and science alike. The creative act often begins with inspiration, an image, a hunch, a problem that chooses the thinker rather than the other way around. That's the self calling. The ego responds with discipline, shaping the raw impulse into form. Without the self, creativity is mechanical. Without the ego, it dissolves into chaos. The masterpiece appears when the two voices work in harmony. Jung believed that the future of humanity depends on this harmony. He saw modern culture as dominated by ego, obsessed with control, technology, and surface knowledge, while starving for meaning. The unconscious, ignored for too long, returns as crisis, anxiety, alienation, collective anger. The only cure, he thought, was inner dialogue. Each person must rediscover their own self, reconnecting the personal with the timeless. In therapy, he would often end a session in silence. He wanted patients to hear what remained unsaid, that faint inner echo that begins once words stop. The self, he wrote, is not found by thinking, but by listening. It does not demand faith, only attention. When the ego finally learns to listen, life changes. Coincidences begin to feel like communication. Dreams begin to make sense. Decisions start to flow from a deeper place. To live in awareness of these two voices is to live between worlds. The measurable and the mysterious, the planned and the destined. It means allowing your mind to speak and your soul to answer. The ego asks, "What should I do?" The self replies, "Who are you becoming?" The dialogue never ends, but if you listen long enough, they begin to harmonize. And perhaps that is the secret Jung wanted us to learn, that the mind is not one voice but a duet. One speaks of survival, the other of meaning. One builds the day, the other shapes the soul. To live wisely is to let them both be heard, until your life itself becomes their shared song. Chapter 11. The Path of Individuation. Carl Jung believed that beneath the routines of everyday life lies a quiet movement, guiding every human being toward inner wholeness. He called this movement individuation, a process through which the fragments of the psyche gradually unite into a balanced, conscious whole. To individuate is not to perfect oneself or to rise above humanity, but to become authentic, to live in harmony with one's entire nature, both known and unknown. For Jung, this process was not reserved for mystics or intellectuals. It was the central task of being alive. He described individuation as a dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. The ego is the conscious self, the part that plans, acts, and identifies with roles. The unconscious is everything that lives beneath awareness: instincts, memories, desires, and archetypal images that shape behavior without our knowledge. When the ego begins to listen to this deeper realm, the psyche reorganizes itself around a new center: the self, a symbol of totality that includes both light and shadow. The self is not the ego enlarged, but the larger field in which the ego exists. The goal of life, Jung said, is not to eliminate the unconscious or dominate it, but to bring its contents into awareness until consciousness becomes as inclusive as possible. Individuation often begins with crisis. A loss, a failure, or an inexplicable emptiness breaks the illusion that the ego is in control. Jung saw such moments not as mistakes, but as calls from the self. When outer stability collapses, the inner world starts to speak more clearly. Dreams intensify. Emotions grow unpredictable. Symbols emerge from nowhere. The ego resists at first, interpreting these disturbances as problems to solve. But in truth, the psyche is trying to heal itself, seeking balance after too much repression or one-sidedness. Individuation always starts with disorientation. One must lose the old map to find a deeper one. The first great task in this journey is to meet the shadow. The shadow contains everything the ego refuses to acknowledge: shame, anger, envy, desire, and fear, but also forgotten talents and vitality. Because the conscious mind rejects these aspects, they project outward. We see them in others, criticize them, or fear them. Jung taught that reclaiming the shadow is not about becoming dark or destructive. It is about recovering honesty. Only by admitting what we are can we choose how to live with it consciously. The person who integrates their shadow becomes more whole, less judgmental, and paradoxically, more humane. Beyond the shadow lies another frontier: the anima and animus, the inner images of the opposite gender that bridge the conscious and unconscious. The anima connects men to intuition, emotion, and imagination. The animus connects women to strength, logic, and clarity. These figures appear in dreams, fantasies, and projections onto lovers or mentors. When unrecognized, they control relationships through idealization or resentment. When integrated, they enrich the personality, allowing one to think and feel, act and imagine with equal depth. Jung considered this union of masculine and feminine principles a vital step towards psychic wholeness, because true integration dissolves division within the soul. Jung compared individuation to the alchemical process of turning base metal into gold. The metal is the raw material of the personality, impulses, wounds, and contradictions, while the gold is consciousness refined by experience. Fire symbolizes life itself, challenges, losses, and transformations that burn away falseness. The ego cannot manufacture the gold. It must submit to the alchemical heat of living honestly. Each crisis, each moment of confusion, becomes part of this inner chemistry. The self uses both suffering and joy as tools for creation. He emphasized that individuation is not withdrawal from the world, but deeper participation in it. People who integrate their unconscious become less driven by compulsion and more guided by purpose. They relate to others without projection, act from inner necessity rather than imitation, and recognize meaning even in difficulty. Jung observed that such individuals often radiate calmness, as if anchored in something larger than personal success. Their authority is quiet, because it does not come from control, but from understanding. Still, the path is demanding. Jung said that no one can individuate without pain. The process strips away illusions, the belief that one's values are absolute, that one's identity is final, that life should be free from contradiction. Individuation requires learning to live within paradox, holding tension without rushing to resolve it. To Jung, consciousness grows not by avoiding opposites, but by enduring them until a third, reconciling insight emerges. This principle, which he called enantiodromia, describes how one-sidedness always turns into its opposite. Pride becomes humiliation, control becomes chaos, rigidity becomes collapse. By observing these cycles within ourselves, we learn humility and balance. Individuation also has a spiritual dimension. Jung regarded the self as the psychological image of God, the organizing principle of meaning that transcends the ego's limited understanding. When people experience profound dreams, synchronicities, or inner peace, they are glimpsing the self's influence. But Jung warned that one must approach this experience with reverence, not inflation. The ego that identifies itself with the divine loses proportion and becomes fanatic. True individuation leads not to grandiosity, but to humility, the realization that one participates in something vast, not that one commands it. He believed that individuation mirrors humanity's broader evolution. Just as individuals integrate their shadow, societies must integrate theirs. Wars, prejudice, and moral crises reflect collective projections of what cultures refuse to own within themselves. Every act of personal self-awareness, Jung said, slightly reduces the world's unconsciousness. Healing the individual contributes to healing the collective, because both arise from the same psychic field. Jung's writings portray individuation as a spiral rather than a straight path. One revisits the same themes repeatedly, each time at a deeper level. Old patterns return, but their meaning shifts. Growth is measured not by elimination of conflict, but by expansion of consciousness. Even at life's end, the psyche continues to integrate new aspects of experience. Jung viewed aging not as decline but as culmination, the gradual return of the ego to the self, where opposites reconcile. He believed death itself was not annihilation, but transformation, the final stage of individuation, through which consciousness re-enters the greater whole from which it came. To walk this path requires discipline and imagination. Jung encouraged keeping dream journals, drawing, or meditating on symbolic images to maintain dialogue with the unconscious. He found that the psyche often expresses itself through circular mandalas, geometric designs that represent wholeness. Patients would draw them spontaneously during times of transformation. To Jung, this showed that the soul instinctively seeks order. When chaos threatens, it paints a circle to remember its own unity. Ultimately, individuation is not about escaping humanity, but embracing it fully. It is the art of becoming whole without denying contradiction, of living between freedom and fate with grace. The individuated person is neither saint nor sage, but simply aware that every joy and sorrow participates in a larger pattern of meaning. Life becomes less about control and more about cooperation with the self's unfolding design. Jung often said that the purpose of individuation is not to make life easier, but to make it more real. To live consciously is to see every event as dialogue between inner and outer worlds, every challenge as an opportunity for integration. When the ego learns to listen, the self begins to lead, and the fragments of the psyche gradually form a harmony. Individuation is the music of that harmony, the sound of a life becoming whole, not by rising above its opposites, but by learning to hold them in balance. Chapter 12. The language of myth. Carl Jung believed that myth is the original language of the human psyche. Long before psychology existed, people told stories about gods, heroes, and monsters to express inner experiences they could not name. Myths were not primitive science or superstition. They were symbolic truths about the structure of the soul. Jung called them the dreams of humanity, expressions of the collective unconscious that speak in images rather than logic. He noticed that across cultures and centuries, myths repeated the same essential patterns. There was always a hero called to adventure, a descent into darkness, a struggle with chaos, and a return transformed. These repetitions were not coincidences, but evidence of shared archetypes, universal psychic patterns that shape how humans experience love, loss, fear, and renewal. The story of a god dying and being reborn, for instance, appears in Egypt, Greece, and Christianity because it reflects the psychological process of transformation that every human undergoes. Myths reveal that we are all variations of the same inner story. For Jung, myth was not a collection of old tales, but a living system of symbols that continues to shape behavior. The archetypes in myths still move within us. The hero who seeks meaning, the shadow who tests, the wise old man who guides, the great mother who nurtures and destroys. When we read these stories or dream of similar figures, we are meeting our own unconscious in symbolic form. Myths remind us that the dramas of the gods are mirrors of the human soul. He believed that each person lives within a myth, whether they realize it or not. Some live the story of the warrior, forever fighting to prove worth. Others live the story of the healer or the wanderer. Our personal narrative gives shape to our choices and values. Consciousness begins when we ask, which myth am I living? To recognize this is to begin individuation, to see one's life as part of a universal pattern rather than a random sequence of events. Jung warned that modern society, by rejecting myth, had become psychologically impoverished. Science explained how the world works, but could not explain why we suffer, dream, or long for purpose. Without myth, people lose a sense of meaning and become possessed by ideologies, obsessions, or addictions, modern versions of forgotten gods. He wrote that when a culture denies its myths, the archetypes return unconsciously in distorted forms. The hero becomes the fanatic. The prophet becomes the demagogue. The search for transcendence becomes the pursuit of power or fame. Humanity, he said, cannot live without myth. It only forgets that it is living one. In therapy, Jung often guided patients to rediscover their personal mythology through dreams and symbols. When a patient dreamed of descending into a cave, he saw in it the ancient motif of the hero entering the underworld to face the unconscious. When someone dreamed of a wounded animal, he saw the archetype of instinct injured by modern rationality. By interpreting these images, people could recover meaning from chaos. The psyche, he said, speaks in mythic language. Healing begins when we learn to understand it. He found the same symbolism in alchemy, which he interpreted not as chemistry, but as spiritual metaphor. The alchemist's effort to turn lead into gold symbolized the transformation of the unconscious into consciousness, of instinct into wisdom. Their strange diagrams and creatures expressed what modern psychology would later describe as integration, the slow, fiery process of becoming whole. Jung called this myth the secret history of the soul, disguised for centuries as science. Art, religion, and even science, Jung believed, are modern forms of myth-making. A powerful painting, a symphony, or a scientific theory can awaken archetypal emotions because they touch the same inner structures that myths once did. Artists and thinkers become vessels through which collective symbols renew themselves. This is why great works endure. They speak to something deeper than time or culture. To Jung, living without myth is like living without gravity. It leaves people rootless, uncertain of where they belong in the vastness of existence. Myths provide a symbolic orientation. They teach that suffering has meaning, that death feeds renewal, that chaos can give birth to order. A mythic worldview does not require literal belief in gods. It requires symbolic awareness, the ability to see everyday events as part of a larger conversation between the conscious and the unconscious. He often distinguished between unconscious and conscious living. When we live unconsciously, myths act through us. We repeat their dramas without realizing it. When we live consciously, we participate in them creatively, shaping how the pattern unfolds. Awareness turns fate into choice. To Jung, this was the essence of deep thought, not analysis, but symbolic understanding of life's unfolding story. He believed the next great myth of humanity would center not on gods in heaven, but on the discovery of the divine within, the reconciliation of consciousness with the unconscious. The modern world, having conquered the external, now needed to rediscover the inner. The future of civilization, he said, depended on renewing contact with myth, because myth gives meaning to knowledge and soul to progress. In the end, Jung saw myth as both origin and destination. It connects the individual to something timeless, reminding us that every struggle echoes an ancient rhythm. To think mythically is to live in conversation with that rhythm, to see in love, loss, and change the same eternal story retold through your own life. Myths do not explain the world. They make it meaningful. They teach that behind every event is a pattern, behind every moment a story still unfolding. When we learn to read that story, life ceases to feel random. It becomes a dialogue between the human mind and the mysterious whole of existence. Chapter 13. The Shadow of Civilization. Carl Jung believed that what is true for an individual is also true for humanity as a whole. Just as every person has a shadow, a hidden reservoir of impulses, fears, and desires, the world itself has one. He called this the collective shadow, the sum of everything societies deny or repress. When people refuse to confront the darkness within, that darkness does not disappear. It gathers strength beneath the surface of culture, waiting to be projected outward. Wars, fanaticism, prejudice, and moral corruption, Jung said, are not created by isolated individuals. They are eruptions of the collective shadow, our own disowned humanity returned to us in monstrous form. To understand this idea, Jung asked us to imagine society as a psyche. Its conscious life consists of laws, ideals, and moral systems, the stories it tells about who it is. Beneath that lies the collective unconscious, filled with archetypes, instincts, and emotional energies that have evolved over millennia. Civilization depends on repression. Without it, chaos would reign. Yet too much repression breeds imbalance. When entire cultures deny aggression, greed, or envy, those forces migrate into the collective shadow and seek expression elsewhere. The more a society insists on its purity, the more violently the shadow eventually returns. Jung witnessed this on a global scale during the 20th century. He saw fascism, totalitarianism, and mass violence as psychological epidemics, projections of humanity's repressed instincts. Nations, like individuals, fall prey to the illusion of moral superiority. They divide the world into good and evil, then unconsciously embody the very darkness they condemn. The change must begin within one man, Jung wrote, for no one can change the world unless he first changes himself. The shadow cannot be destroyed by force. It must be recognized and integrated. He traced this pattern back to myth. Every culture tells stories of gods or heroes who fall victim to their own hubris. These tales are not warnings about supernatural punishment. They are psychological truths. Whenever light denies its connection to darkness, the fall becomes inevitable. Jung saw modern civilization as repeating this archetype on a collective scale. Humanity's worship of reason, technology, and progress had created enormous external power, but left the inner world neglected. The gods were not dead, he said. They had become diseases of the soul, appearing as ideologies, addictions, and obsessions that enslave rather than enlighten. He did not reject progress, but he warned that without psychological awareness, it leads to imbalance. Science gives humanity control over matter, but not over its own instincts. Religion provides moral codes, but when used to deny the unconscious, it breeds guilt and hypocrisy. Ideologies promise salvation, yet demand conformity. In every system that claims absolute truth, Jung saw the same danger. The ego of civilization inflating beyond its limits, forgetting that wisdom requires humility before the unknown. The collective shadow reveals itself in the language of projection. Groups define themselves by what they hate: the enemy, the outsider, the heretic. What they despise most often mirrors what they secretly fear within themselves. When societies condemn violence while glorifying domination, or preach equality while enforcing hierarchy, they are caught in shadow paradoxes. Jung argued that political and moral reform alone cannot resolve these contradictions. Only psychological insight can. To heal a culture, individuals must become conscious of their participation in its unconscious dynamics. He described this awakening as a moral responsibility of the modern age. The ancient world externalized evil in myths and demons. Now we must recognize that those figures represent us. The line dividing good and evil cuts through every human heart, Jung echoed in his writings. The task is not to destroy evil, but to understand it, to see it as energy that can be transformed. The same instincts that create cruelty can also create courage. The same passion that fuels hate can, when integrated, fuel love. Consciousness alone decides the direction of power. He used the metaphor of alchemy once again. Base instincts are like lead, heavy and dark, but capable of refinement into gold. Repression keeps them heavy. Awareness releases their potential. When an individual accepts their capacity for harm, they become less dangerous, not more. When a nation admits its flaws, it grows wiser. Jung believed that self-knowledge, both personal and collective, is the only safeguard against barbarism. Without it, history repeats its worst patterns under new disguises. Jung also recognized the collective shadow in the way societies exploit nature. He saw humanity's separation from the natural world as a psychological projection, an attempt to deny its animal origins. Modern people, he said, act like gods who have forgotten they are also creatures. The environmental crises of his time were not merely economic or political, but symbolic, a reflection of humanity's alienation from its own instincts. The more we dominate nature, the more we destroy the mirror that shows us who we are. To reconcile with nature, we must reconcile with the instinctive parts of ourselves that civilization has exiled. He believed that art, myth, and dreams offer paths toward integration. Through creativity, the unconscious finds expression without destruction. The artist becomes a medium for collective renewal, translating the shadow's energy into form and meaning. When a culture listens to its artists, it listens to its unconscious. When it silences them, the repressed returns through crisis. Jung saw modern art, even in its chaos, as the psyche's attempt to heal, to make visible what civilization prefers to hide. He did not imagine that integration of the shadow would end conflict or suffering. Darkness, he said, is not an error in the design of life. It is a condition of consciousness. Light and shadow define each other. What matters is not elimination, but balance, the ongoing effort to recognize complexity instead of retreating into moral simplicity. A civilization capable of that recognition would be one where individuals accept responsibility for their inner lives instead of projecting them outward as enemies. Jung warned that the collective shadow could overwhelm humanity if ignored. The 20th century had shown how technology magnifies the unconscious, how one man's hatred can become a nation's ideology, how a single invention can destroy cities. He feared that unless psychological insight kept pace with power, the world would remain vulnerable to its own nightmares. Yet he also believed that crises serve the same function in history as they do in the individual psyche. They force consciousness to evolve. The horrors of his century, he hoped, might one day awaken humanity to its need for self-understanding. For Jung, redemption begins not in governments or revolutions, but in the individual act of awareness. Every time a person confronts their own shadow, the collective unconscious becomes slightly more conscious. The salvation of the world, he wrote, consists in the salvation of the individual soul. To acknowledge one's darkness is not despair, it is a form of love, an act of truthfulness that prevents the shadow from ruling unseen. The shadow of civilization, like the shadow of the self, will never disappear. It will always wait at the edges of awareness, testing our maturity. But if we face it with honesty, it can become our teacher. It reminds us that light without darkness is illusion, that power without humility leads to ruin, and that progress without self-knowledge ends in destruction. To think deeply, in Jung's sense, is to remember that the psyche of humanity and the psyche of the individual are one. The fate of the world, therefore, begins in the silence of each person who dares to look inward and say, "This darkness is also mine." Chapter 14. The inner god Carl Jung believed that religion was not primarily about belief in doctrines or obedience to institutions, but about humanity's direct relationship with the unknown. He called this relationship the experience of the numinous, moments of awe, terror, or reverence that make a person feel both infinitely small and deeply connected to something vast. Every culture, he said, has expressed this experience through different images of God. Yet beneath all those differences lies a single psychological fact: the human need to relate to a greater whole. Jung called this need the religious function of the psyche. He argued that the divine is not an external being living in the sky, but an archetype within, the deepest image of totality that the psyche can conceive. When humanity speaks of God, it is speaking in symbolic form about the self, the center of the psyche that integrates all opposites and gives life meaning. This does not reduce religion to psychology. For Jung, the archetype of God is not an illusion invented by the mind. It is an experience of the mind's encounter with something beyond itself. It is, he wrote, as if the psyche were reaching beyond its own borders toward an incomprehensible mystery. Jung's approach to God was neither atheistic nor dogmatic. He did not ask whether God exists in the usual sense. Instead, he asked what the experience of the divine means for the human psyche. To him, the question of existence was secondary. The fact that people experience powerful symbols of divinity, dreams of light, feelings of destiny, moral revelation, was itself proof that the image of God is psychologically real. It exerts influence, organizes meaning, and shapes the moral life whether or not one believes in theology. In that sense, the divine is not only an idea, but a living presence within the structure of consciousness. He saw the religious impulse as an instinct, one as natural as hunger or curiosity. When repressed, it does not disappear, but re-emerges in distorted forms, the worship of power, money, fame, or ideology. Modernity, Jung believed, had not outgrown religion. It had simply replaced its gods with unconscious substitutes. The skyscraper became the new cathedral, the political leader, the new savior, the screen, the new altar. The loss of symbolic awareness, he said, is not progress, but a psychological crisis. Without relationship to the numinous, life becomes mechanical, and the human spirit grows hollow. Jung's personal life reflected this struggle. As a young man, he felt torn between scientific rationality and deep spiritual experience. He studied medicine and psychiatry, yet his dreams were filled with ancient temples, serpents, and cosmic visions. Rather than dismissing them as madness, he treated them as communications from the unconscious, his own soul trying to restore balance. In time, he realized that science and religion were not opposites, but two ways of describing the same mystery: the meeting of consciousness with the unknown. The language of religion speaks in images. The language of science speaks in concepts. Both, he believed, are partial expressions of the same underlying reality. For Jung, the image of God evolves with human consciousness. Ancient peoples projected divinity into nature, the storm, the river, the sun, because they had not yet recognized those forces within themselves. As awareness expanded, divinity took more human form, reflecting the growing sense of individuality. The gods of myth became the god of monotheism, a moral intelligence mirroring the structure of the human psyche. In the modern era, Jung believed, the next step of evolution is for humanity to reclaim the divine image inwardly, to see that the source of meaning lies not beyond the world, but within it. The gods have become diseases, he once wrote, but they can also become healing powers if we recognize them as psychic realities. This recognition, however, carries risk. When people discover the divine within, they may confuse the self with the ego and become inflated, believing themselves to be gods. Jung saw this danger in mystics who lost touch with reality and in political leaders who claimed divine authority. True spirituality, he said, demands humility. The ego must recognize the self as greater than itself. The experience of God within is not empowerment alone. It is confrontation with mystery, with the infinite depth of being that dwarfs human comprehension. Genuine religious experience always humbles before it uplifts. He believed that symbols of divinity, crosses, mandalas, circles of light, are bridges between the conscious and unconscious mind. They give shape to experiences that words cannot contain. In therapy, Jung often saw patients spontaneously produce such images in dreams or drawings during times of crisis. To him, this was evidence that the psyche itself creates its own symbols of the divine when the old ones no longer suffice. Religion, therefore, is not fixed. It renews itself from within. When one myth dies, another begins to form in the depths. Jung's idea of the inner God challenged both traditional religion and scientific materialism. The theologians feared he was reducing God to psychology. The scientists feared he was reintroducing mysticism into reason. But Jung saw his work as a bridge between both worlds. He believed that psychology could restore meaning to modern life, not by replacing religion, but by revealing its psychological foundation. To live without a sense of the sacred, he said, is to live without depth. Without connection to something larger than ourselves, the ego becomes tyrannical, and society loses its moral compass. He found in the Christian myth a profound symbol of individuation, the reconciliation of opposites through suffering and love. The figure of Christ, for Jung, represents the self, the image of wholeness that includes both human and divine, light and shadow. The crucifixion symbolizes the painful union of these opposites, consciousness nailed to the cross of its own duality. Whether one believes in its literal truth or not, the story, he said, describes an eternal psychological reality, the redemption that occurs when the conscious self accepts the dark and the divine as parts of one total being. Jung's vision of the future was not a return to dogma, but a new form of spirituality grounded in experience. He imagined a world where people no longer outsource the divine to institutions, but encounter it directly through dreams, creativity, and reflection. The inner God, as he described it, is not an authority dictating from above, but a living center within, urging balance and meaning. To follow that voice requires silence, humility, and patience, the same qualities needed for deep psychological work. He often said that the goal of life is to make consciousness coextensive with the whole of the psyche. The image of God is part of that wholeness. When we ignore it, it acts through us unconsciously, shaping history through fanaticism and despair. When we engage it consciously, it becomes guidance, a force that leads toward integration rather than fragmentation. The self, the inner God, does not ask for worship, but for awareness. In the end, Jung's theology of the psyche was not about belief, but about relationship. He urged people to treat the numinous as real, not necessarily in the literal sense, but in the way it moves the soul. To deny the divine experience, whatever form it takes, is to cut off half of human nature. To accept it is to enter into dialogue with the mystery that sustains life. We need a God, Jung wrote, not to believe in, but to experience. The inner God, then, is not a figure to be found in heaven, but a presence felt in the depths of consciousness. The still, guiding intelligence that whispers through symbols, dreams, and intuition. When one learns to listen to that voice, the world no longer feels random. Every joy, every suffering becomes part of a greater unfolding. The task of deep thinking, as Jung saw it, is not to solve the mystery of God, but to participate in it, to recognize that the divine is not separate from the human, and that the greatest act of reverence is simply to become fully aware of one's own soul. Chapter 15. The Alchemy of the Soul. Carl Jung believed that the transformation of the human psyche followed the same logic as alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metals into gold. He saw in the alchemists' symbols a hidden record of inner change, describing not chemical experiments, but psychological processes. What they called furnaces and vessels, he saw as images of the human mind under pressure. What they called gold, he understood as the self, the complete, integrated soul. To Jung, alchemy was humanity's earliest psychology, expressed in poetic and mystical language long before the modern era could explain it scientifically. The alchemists spoke of stages: nigredo, albedo, and rubedo, blackening, whitening, and reddening. Jung recognized these as phases of psychic transformation. The nigredo represents dissolution, the stage of darkness and despair when old identities collapse. Psychologically, it is the period of confusion and loss that often precedes insight. The ego feels trapped, unable to control its world, but the breakdown is necessary. Only when the fixed structures of personality melt can something new emerge. Jung often reminded his patients that psychological growth begins in the ashes of certainty. The blackening is the fire that softens the metal of the soul. From the ashes rises the albedo, the whitening. Here light begins to return. Clarity, reflection, and purification take place. A person starts to see meaning in what once felt like chaos. It is the stage of self-knowledge, when unconscious material becomes visible through dreams, art, or contemplation. The psyche cleanses itself through honesty and understanding. But Jung warned that this stage can be deceptive. A premature sense of peace can stop transformation halfway. The work continues until consciousness not only understands, but unites with the unconscious. That union, the rubedo or reddening, marks the birth of the self, the philosopher's stone, the symbol of wholeness. In this state, opposites reconcile. The conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter begin to cooperate rather than compete. Jung saw this integration as the true goal of individuation, not perfection, but balance. The person who reaches this stage lives from a deeper center, guided by meaning rather than habit. The ego no longer dominates, it serves the self. Life becomes less about control and more about participation in a creative unfolding. Jung found that this alchemical structure appeared naturally in dreams and myths. People who were going through psychological transformation often dreamed of fire, melting, or circular symbols, signs that their psyche was reorganizing itself. He concluded that alchemy was a symbolic mirror of the human soul's development. The alchemists, without knowing it, were projecting their own inner evolution onto matter. They worked with metals, but what truly changed was themselves. He also saw therapy as an alchemical vessel, a space where transformation occurs through tension, dialogue, and patience. In analysis, both therapist and patient enter the crucible. Emotions rise and fall like heat and pressure. Resistances dissolve, insights crystallize. The process cannot be rushed. It follows the same rhythm as alchemy: dissolution, purification, integration. Jung said the goal of therapy was not to make life easier, but to make it more meaningful, to help a person participate consciously in their own great work. Central to this work is the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. The alchemists believed gold could be created only by joining sun and moon, fire and water. Jung saw this as the psyche's deepest task, reconciling reason with emotion, light with shadow, masculine with feminine. Modern culture, he thought, had become one-sided, valuing intellect and control while repressing feeling and instinct. The return of the irrational, in art, dreams, and even social chaos, was the unconscious trying to restore balance. The psyche, like nature, always seeks equilibrium. He admired the alchemists' patience and humility. Their work demanded solitude, repetition, and faith in invisible processes. Jung believed inner growth required the same discipline. Facing one's shadow, listening to dreams, or enduring confusion are forms of psychological labor. Transformation is not achieved by willpower, but through attention. The soul refines itself slowly, through honest confrontation with its contradictions. Like the alchemists, we must tend our inner fire, not too hot to destroy, not too cold to stagnate. Jung also saw alchemy as a corrective to modern life. Where science seeks to dissect and control, alchemy seeks to cooperate with mystery. The alchemist does not force change but collaborates with nature's intelligence. Jung believed this attitude could heal humanity's alienation from the world. Our obsession with mastery, he warned, had created a spiritual imbalance mirrored in environmental destruction and psychological emptiness. Alchemy reminds us that transformation begins not by conquering nature, but by understanding it, within and without. The great work, or magnum opus, is the art of becoming whole. It is not about escaping the world, but sanctifying it. The alchemists said, "As above, so below, as within, so without." Jung saw in this the truth that inner and outer realities are reflections of each other. When the psyche transforms, the world appears renewed. Meaning returns, not because life has changed, but because consciousness has deepened. The gold the alchemists sought was never metal. It was the awakened soul, aware of its unity with all existence. He often said that every person performs the great work, consciously or not. Life itself is the alchemical fire, melting and reshaping us through love, loss, success, and failure. The question is whether we resist or cooperate. Those who resist remain stuck in the negredo, repeating old patterns. Those who cooperate learn to see purpose even in suffering. Jung called this faith in the process of life. The soul, he said, knows what it is doing. When we trust that knowledge, pain becomes transformation, and darkness becomes the prelude to light. The alchemy of the soul is not a fantasy of perfection, but an attitude toward existence. It teaches that everything, even chaos, can serve growth. It invites us to see each experience as raw material for awareness. The lead of fear becomes courage. The ashes of failure become wisdom. What emerges is not purity, but wholeness, a self no longer divided against itself. In the end, Jung saw alchemy as a timeless map of the inner journey. It shows that the way to consciousness runs through conflict, and that the deepest meaning of suffering is renewal. The true gold, he said, is not at the end of the process, but in the process itself, in the continual act of becoming aware. The alchemist's furnace is the human heart, and its fire is the will to understand. Through that fire, the ordinary becomes sacred, and the self becomes what it was always meant to be, not perfect, but whole. Chapter 16. The Mirror of the Unconscious. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious is not a dark pit to be feared, but a mirror that reflects the truth of who we are. Everything we refuse to acknowledge, forgotten memories, unlived desires, hidden potentials, gathers there, waiting to be seen. To Jung, this unseen realm was not chaos, but a living system that completes consciousness. The task of a thoughtful life is not to conquer the unconscious, but to learn from it, to read its reflections with humility and patience. He described the unconscious as the great unknown within, a field that holds both danger and wisdom. On one side lies the personal unconscious, our individual experiences, emotions, and complexes. On the other lies the collective unconscious, a deeper layer filled with universal images inherited from the history of humanity. Together, these layers shape how we think, dream, and feel long before reason takes part. The unconscious is the soil from which consciousness grows. Ignoring it, Jung warned, is like trying to live by cutting off one's roots. The unconscious reveals itself through dreams, symbols, and spontaneous emotions. When people dream, they step into the theater of their psyche. There, the forgotten and the repressed return disguised as stories. A person might dream of being chased, trapped, or falling, images of anxiety that speak of something unresolved. Another might dream of water, light, or flight, signs of renewal or transcendence. Jung urged people to approach such dreams not with superstition, but with curiosity. Each image, he said, is a message in symbolic form, offering insight into the balance or imbalance of the inner world. For Jung, the goal is not to interpret dreams mechanically, but to enter into dialogue with them. The psyche speaks symbolically because it expresses things that words cannot yet contain. When we reflect on our dreams, notice recurring themes, and ask what emotion they evoke, we begin to bridge the conscious and unconscious. He called this process active imagination, a method of engaging the images of the mind as if they were living presences. In this conversation, something begins to change. The unconscious no longer overwhelms consciousness, but becomes its partner. He compared the relationship between ego and unconscious to that of a small island floating on a vast sea. The island represents the known world, logic, order, identity. The sea represents everything beyond it, instinct, memory, mystery. The tides constantly erode the shore, reshaping it. To live consciously is to maintain the dialogue between land and water. If the ego denies the sea, it becomes rigid and lifeless. If it is swallowed by it, it drowns in chaos. Balance lies in respecting both realms. Jung warned that modern society, obsessed with reason and control, had forgotten the mirror of the unconscious. People had turned inwardness into pathology, treating dreams as random noise and emotions as chemical reactions. But the unconscious, when ignored, does not disappear. It returns through neurosis, projection, or crisis. What we fail to face within ourselves, we meet again in the world as fate. The person who represses anger becomes surrounded by conflict. The one who denies fear becomes drawn to danger. The unconscious reflects what the conscious mind refuses to see. This reflection, however, is not punishment, but guidance. Jung said that the psyche seeks equilibrium the way the body seeks health. Symptoms, moods, or sudden images arise not to harm, but to heal. A recurring dream, a strange coincidence, or an overwhelming emotion may be the psyche's way of drawing attention to what needs integration. When consciousness listens instead of resists, insight appears. The mirror does not judge, it reveals. He often described the unconscious as a friend disguised as a stranger. At first it seems threatening because it confronts the ego's illusions of control. But behind the darkness lies creativity, intuition, and spiritual depth. Many of Jung's patients discovered that what they feared most, their anger, loneliness, or uncertainty, contained the very energy they needed to feel alive. To reclaim that energy, one must be willing to look directly into the mirror, even when the reflection is uncomfortable. He believed that art, religion, and mythology were all expressions of this mirror. The stories of gods, monsters, and heroes are projections of inner dynamics. The hero's journey is the path of consciousness, descending into the unconscious to recover lost treasure, wisdom, love, or identity, before returning to the world transformed. Every myth, Jung said, is a psychological truth disguised as a story. To read myth symbolically is to read the language of the soul. Jung's method of dream analysis was not about prediction, but participation. He would ask patients to describe their dreams in detail, then reflect on what each symbol meant personally. A snake might represent danger to one person, but renewal to another. A house might symbolize the self, with each floor representing a layer of consciousness. The goal was not to solve the dream, but to build a relationship with it, to recognize that the unconscious is alive and purposeful. He called this cooperation between consciousness and the unconscious individuation, the process through which a person becomes whole. It is not achieved by avoiding conflict, but by holding opposites in awareness until they find balance. The unconscious provides what consciousness lacks. The dream compensates for one-sidedness. Emotion restores feeling to overthinking. Symbol restores meaning to routine. The mirror corrects the distortion of self-perception, showing both the flaws and the beauty we overlook. Jung saw this balance as essential not only for individuals, but for humanity. The collective unconscious holds the archetypes that shape civilization itself. When societies repress parts of their shared psyche, emotion, instinct, mystery, those energies return as cultural crises, wars, fanaticism, ecological destruction. The mirror reflects at every scale. The healing of the world begins with the healing of the individual soul, and that healing begins with self-awareness. To look into the mirror of the unconscious, Jung said, is to see both shadow and light. The shadow reveals our hidden faults, but also our unclaimed strengths. The light reveals our potential for wisdom and compassion. True consciousness arises when we can hold both reflections without denial. The person who accepts their shadow becomes less dangerous. The one who acknowledges their light becomes more responsible. Jung believed that the mirror deepens with age. In youth, the unconscious appears as adventure, something to explore. In midlife, it becomes challenge, something to reconcile. In later years, it becomes mystery, something to surrender to. The journey ends not in mastery, but in understanding. The recognition that the unconscious is not an enemy to conquer, but a companion guiding us toward wholeness. In the end, the unconscious is not a void, but a mirror that reveals the totality of the soul. When we dare to look into it with honesty, we discover that what stares back is not a stranger, but a greater version of ourselves. Vast, creative, and alive. The task of life, Jung believed, is to learn to live with that reflection, to let it teach us that consciousness is not separation from the depths, but their illumination. The mirror does not lie. It only waits for us to see.